At the Nocturnus, we are careful to ensure that all stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. Details may have been changed to ensure patient confidentiality. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
In the United States, our incarcerated population is almost 2.5 times the population of San Francisco, where we record this podcast. And like us all, those who are incarcerated get sick, they grow old, and eventually they die. And often, their final days are complicated. I'm Emily Silverman, and this is The Nocturnus, stories from the world of medicine. Physician Michele DiTomas takes care of incarcerated men at the end of their lives. Her job is tough and full of bureaucratic hurdles. In this story, Michele tells us about a time when she races against the clock to help a dying man go home. After the story, Michele and I talk about health and the criminal justice system and how much of our prison population struggles with mental illness. How can we do better? Here's Michele.
So about 4 years ago, my son's second grade teacher came up to me and she said, "I hear you're quitting your job." Now I know her pretty well because she also taught my daughters, but I have no idea what she's talking about. So as my son and I are walking across the playground, I ask him, "So why'd you tell Miss Justino I was quitting my job?" And he reminds me of a dinner conversation we had a few weeks ago. "Remember, you told us that story about the man? They put him in a room all by himself for a really long time, and he went crazy? And you said you hated your job and you were going to quit." Oh, right. I remember. So for the last 12 years, I've worked as a physician for the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. In my mind, I go back and forth between frustration with the system, guilt for being part of it, and the hope that what I'm doing makes some difference. I guess this can be confusing for an 8-year-old. Actually, it's a little confusing for me sometimes. And part of how I deal with it is by telling myself that I'm not a prison doctor because I have to be. I have options. I can quit. I can go home anytime I want. So anyway, the next day I go to work in a 3-story cement building surrounded by razor wire that serves as the entire world for some 2,500 men. I show my ID to the officer, go through the sally port, and head down the main line as a couple hundred men in blue come towards me on their way to breakfast. First I see Mr. Bell. He nods and smiles as he cruises by with his walker. He's 87 years old, and he had a sentence of 7 years to life. He always thought if he just followed the rules and served his time, he'd go home to his wife and kids. So far, he's been a model prisoner for 37 years. Next, I see Miss Stevens. She's a transgender woman with a great smile. She says, "Good morning, Doc." And I smile, but every time I see her, I can't believe she's serving life in prison for a 3rd strike of stealing mascara. She got out under Prop 36, actually. So as I get to the end of the hallway, I see a young man that I don't know very well. He has an ink blot-shaped scar on his forehead from banging his head against the wall so much. One time, I had to remove a toothbrush from his arm. He'd pushed it through the skin and into the muscle, and it had gotten stuck. I asked him why he'd done that, and he told me that his grandma had sent him an Easter card, and it made him feel too sad. When I get to the hospice where I'm rounding this morning, the nurse gives me an update on our patients and lets me know that Mr. Turner had died. All he wanted to do before he died was to say goodbye to his daughter. She was in a psychiatric isolation unit at a women's prison in Southern California. And inmates aren't usually allowed to talk to other inmates. But our warden is kind of used to us pushing the boundaries, and he got the other warden to agree. So they took Mr. Turner's schizophrenic daughter and put her in a therapeutic module. That's code for a telephone booth-sized cage, and allowed them a 15-minute phone call to say goodbye. To their credit, they also pulled together her mental health team to help her process her grief afterwards. And one of the officers from the other facility actually sent me an email the next day, thanking me for allowing him to participate. He said in 25 years of service, this was one of the most rewarding things he'd done. The nurse and I are so happy that Mr. Turner got to say goodbye to his daughter. And I'm happy that we have one more person in the system who understands that maintaining safety and security and allowing people their humanity are not mutually exclusive. On days like this, I think maybe I'll keep this job. So after I complete the death packet and discharge Mr. Turner's body to the morgue, I look across the room and I see my new admission for the day. He's a young man, thin but kind of muscular, not my usual hospice patient, and I wonder, why is he here? I open his chart, and I see he's 33, and in his first year of a 5-year sentence, his childhood cancer returned. He was sent to UCSF, he got the best possible treatment, but this time the tumor was too aggressive, and now he has less than 6 months to live. After I finish his history and physical, we talk about his end-of-life goals. He's come to hospice because he wants to spend as much time with his family as possible, and he's really hoping to go home on compassionate release. He only has 1 year left, and he could live with his mother if he got out. The problem is, in order to apply for compassionate release, you have to have less than 6 months to live. And the process takes 3 to 4 months at best. So most people don't live long enough to get it. And even if you do, less than 10% are approved anyway. So the next day, his mother visits, and she asks to speak to the doctor. Between sobs, she tells me that it's her fault he's going to die in prison. It was her car he stole. She was tired of his drug use, his burglaries. Her sister said she was enabling him. So when she woke up that morning and her car was gone, the car she needed to get to work, she was angry and tired, and she called the police. And because of that phone call, she's terrified he's going to die in prison. Please don't let him die here, she sobs. I fill out the paperwork for compassionate release, and we wait. A month later, his cheeks and temples are sunken, his movements are slowing, and sometimes the nurse has to help him to the bathroom. His paperwork is made through a number of hurdles. He's been approved by medical, by local custody. The Secretary of Corrections has reviewed his paperwork and moved it back to the sentencing court, who will make the final decision. His mother visits whenever she can, and we all hear the clock ticking. More time passes, and now his chest looks like a birdcage covered in skin. Sometimes he's too tired to talk. His mother sits at his bedside holding his hand, and I watch them. And I can't believe he's going to die here. I call the court, and they tell me that his hearing is set for next week. I've already shared my medical opinion that he has less than a month to live, possibly less than a week. He's completely bedbound. He's clearly not a danger to society. It's Friday afternoon, and the judge makes his decision. Approved for compassionate release, and the system must let him go. But they have 14 days to do so. I leave the hospice and go to the administrative building, where those who actually have the power to get him out sit. The associate warden is sitting in his Band-Aid colored office with neat stacks of paper on his desk. He looks up from his computer to hear my story. He wants to help, but there are policies and procedures that must be followed. We have to review his custodial factors. We have to be sure that there's not an outstanding warrant for his arrest in another county. These things take time. I'm listening politely, but inside my head, I'm screaming, oh my God, he's gonna be dead in a couple days. But what I say is, he doesn't have time. He can't die here. His mother can't have him die here. I can't have him die here. And I feel the tears sting my eyes. He pauses and looks up. There's a lot of sad things that happen here, and he's never seen me cry. He asked me for my patient's CDCR number, and he plugs it into the computer. And after a few minutes of typing, he says if I can get the notarized court order this evening, he'll have somebody work on it over the weekend, and we can get him out by 11 a.m. on Monday. I thank him, and I go back to the hospice to tell my patient the good news. Monday is so much better than 14 days, and I think he'll be happy. But when I tell him, he doesn't smile. And I can see in his eyes that he doesn't think he'll be alive on Monday. I touch his arm, and I say goodbye. And I go back through the sally port, out the razor wire fence, and back to my other world where I can hug my children anytime I want. At dinner that night, my daughter, as she often does, asked me to tell them a story about work. Then my son, as he often does, sort of rolls his eyes and says something about inappropriate dinner conversation for an 8-year-old. But he looks up, ready for a story. I feel my throat tighten, but I tell them the story. I tell them the story for the same reason that I'm telling you this story, because I need it to be recognized and remembered. As I tell the story at dinner, I realize I'm not going to quit my job. Something about this woman's dying child, her guilt, my need for him to be able to die with dignity, make me realize that it's only because I'm part of the system that I'm able to play my role in these stories. On Monday morning, all of his papers are in order, and he goes home to a comfortable place. And at least for a little while, so do I.
I am sitting here with Michele DiTomas. Thank you so much for coming to talk to me.
Well, thank you for having me.
I'm very excited to talk about the story that you told at our event on health in the criminal justice system, because I feel you brought a really unique perspective to the table. It's not every day that you meet somebody who works in the criminal justice system as a doctor. So maybe for our audience, you could just introduce yourself and your role and where you work.
So currently I'm the chief physician at the California Medical Facility, which is one of 33 prisons in California. I serve as the medical director for the hospice there as well. I'm the chief physician, so my job involves not only clinical care, but helping manage the medical program there and working on systems improvements and quality as well. I'm also the medical director of our hospice, so we have a 17-bed inpatient hospice that serves the men throughout the state of California who have a terminal illness and opt for comfort measures only at the end of their lives.
And it's such a unique job, such a niche in medicine. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your path to medicine in general, and then how you were kind of funneled down this very specific road.
I can't actually remember when I didn't want to be a doctor. Somehow that's what I was going to be. So after going to undergrad and having an opportunity to learn a bit more about the world and taking political science and the other liberal arts areas, I realized that I did want to go to medical school, but I wanted an opportunity to spend some time in the world and learn a little bit more about my place in that world. So I actually was in the Peace Corps, and I was a high school biology teacher for 2 years in a small rural area in East Africa. And I loved being a teacher. I loved going to the market and getting cow hearts and having my students dissect the heart to learn how the blood pumped through. But what I really loved about being a teacher was getting that relationship with the students and getting to the place where they trusted you and would share their stories with you. So this experience as a teacher made me realize that, it's not just the science that makes me want a doctor a good job for me. So after I got back from Africa, I went to med school. And when I did residency, I opted for the UCSF Family Medicine program that specifically has a mission to train doctors to work with an urban underserved population. So I finished residency and was working at a safety net clinic in Berkeley, and there was some prisoners in the state of California who sued the state for not providing a constitutional level of medical care. And they went to court in 2003, and the judge said, "You're right. People are dying unnecessarily, and the medical care is not acceptable." And they gave the California Department of Corrections 2 years to fix it. So when they came back to the table, to the court 2 years later, the judge said, you failed. You haven't corrected the problem. And Felton Henderson, the judge, put the state of California's medical care under a federal receivership. At that time, they gave a large grant to UCSF to provide some services and support as the prison system improved. So the woman who was running that called me and said, I think this is the perfect job for you. So I jumped at it, and I was a consultant there for about a year, and then I was drawn into the program.
And moving on more into your story about going into residency and then hearing about this lawsuit, and there was a phrase that you used that really caught my attention. You said that the population in the prison felt that they weren't having their constitutional level of care. And so what would be an example then of a person in need who wasn't getting the type of care that they deserved as a human being?
So there were people who would have an asthma attack, and they would be evaluated and sent back to their cell, and then they would die there. So
without treatment?
Well, they may have been treated, but it may have only been partial.
I see.
I don't know the details of the cases that were brought forward, but it was estimated by some outside observers that there was probably one person dying unnecessarily in the system a week. There were some physician training issues. Correctional medicine historically may be a place that has attracted people who couldn't be hired elsewhere. So after the receiver took over, all of these things were addressed. Physician salaries, they wanted to attract people who were actually qualified to be working in that type of primary care setting with all of the mental health and other complexities. They created primary care teams so that each patient actually had continuity of care, because as people get older, their medical conditions become more complex, and coming in for sick call or just coming in when you feel sick isn't an adequate way to take care of an elderly man with prostate cancer and diabetes and hypertension and hyperlipidemia. So the whole system was restructured. Part of what makes me able to work in a place that I think has some ethical issues that I disagree with is by seeing those moments where, as an individual, I see a cultural shift. Because I think you can force things by making systems changes. But if you want to really change attitudes, you need to have it done more slowly. And I think with our hospice, it's one place where it's easy to allow people to see little small changes, and seeing people's humanity at the end of their life is sort of a time when many people are able to see that. So in the story, I mention one of the patients I called Mr. Turner, and he wanted to speak to his daughter before he died, but she was incarcerated in another prison. And one of the correctional officers that allowed us to get the two of them together to speak contacted us afterwards and said that this was a really moving experience for him. And it's really important to me that he was able to see that, and that I suspect if he moves up through the ranks, he becomes an associate warden or a warden, he'll remember that experience. And the next time something comes up where you have an opportunity to treat people more humanely.
It's interesting to me what you said about the prison population aging, and just makes me think about all of the overlap that there is with these people, with these patients. For instance, somebody may have landed in jail or prison because of something that they did because of their mental illness. And then the question is, do they belong in jail or prison, or do they belong in a psychiatric facility? And you even mentioned in your story this person with depression who had put the toothbrush into his arm, and that was not in a psychiatric facility. That was right there in prison. And so that line blurring between where does this person belong?
In television, there's this idea of not guilty by reason of insanity. 50% of people within the United States prison system have serious mental illness. New York City County Jail, Cook County, LA County are our largest inpatient psychiatric wards in this country. This is where we take care of our mentally ill people. We don't have enough resources on the outside. So, it's not a question of whether they should be there or not. They are there, and we have to treat them there. At our facility, we have a very large mental health program, and many of the facilities throughout the state do. But the problem is that prison is never, no matter how many good psychiatrists, no matter how many programs, no matter how many groups and supports you give people, prison will never be an appropriate place to treat people with mental illness. It's inherently anxiety-provoking. It's inherently a place where you can't build trusting relationships. It's inherently a place without privacy. There is nothing about the milieu of prison that's going to allow people to be successfully treated from a mental health perspective. So as a society, all of those people, should probably be in some sort of other setting. There are people who've done bad things, and we have to protect the greater society. But you protect them by taking away the person's liberty. And once they go into corrections, we should be doing something to help correct them so that when they go back out into society, we're protecting future victims.
And then aside from just the mental illness, also just thinking about it as an aging population with multiple diseases and terminal diseases who are just aging and requiring complex care, and potentially to the point where they're so debilitated that they're clearly, as was the patient in your story, no longer a harm to society. And so then a similar question comes up, which is, where do they belong? Do we keep them in custody, or is there some sort of exit door or way to transition out once their medical problems become so much that the, point of prison to begin with is no longer really being served and is just hindering their care?
So, the ACLU estimates that with current trends, by 2030, we'll have almost 500,000 geriatric patients within the prison system in the United States. We incarcerate more people in the United States than any other country in the world. So if we keep incarcerating large numbers of people and giving them very long sentences, we will end up with this huge burden that nobody is able to, is prepared to deal with, either logistically, with hearing impaired people, blind people, people in wheelchairs, nor are they prepared to deal with the financial cost of that, let alone the emotional difficulties for those people and their families. So, there is a point where people are very unlikely to recommit. There's three things, actually. Well, there's probably more than that, but three things that lower recidivism are: allowing a higher education, maintaining connections in the community, and being older. People over 50 are much less likely to recommit than other people. And part of why I wanted to tell that story was not just the story of the young man dying in prison, but including the story of the older man who's been there, who went in at 50 and now he's 87. He had a sentence of 7 to life. He thought he was going to go home, and he didn't do anything wrong the whole time he was in prison. Why didn't he go home? And part of it is, I think, that the media likes to portray people who are incarcerated sort of in a monolithic way. And when I have stories that I hear from my patients, it just creates such a complexity. The people inside are as complex as the people outside. They're not monolithic. They have children and parents and stories, and they've made mistakes. And I think if there was a way to have people hear more of these stories, we would be able to move the conversation forward in a different way.
Clearly, this is a flawed system. And I'm wondering, as a physician operating in this system, clearly you have a lot of influence with your individual patients. You have the individual, doctor-patient interaction. Do you, as a physician in your job, have any control over reforming the system or changing the conversation around the system? Less just one-on-one with patients, but more just being a voice that's resounding within the system?
So as a supervisor manager type, I do have opportunities to influence my staff. One area that we've worked really hard as a team to do that is with our older patients and trying to ensure that that our doctors and nurses understand that just because you're incarcerated and you're a ward of the state doesn't mean that you lose your autonomy in terms of your medical decision-making, and that patients truly do have the right to accept treatment, to decline treatment, just as you would in the community. So allowing people to really come to terms with what they want at the end of their lives and how they're going to fill out their advance directive and communicate with their families, and getting them to name their decision maker is something that we've really worked towards as an institution. There's certainly a lot of room to grow, as there is in most places, but I think it's really important to keep that in mind, especially with our older and the inpatient people.
Have you had a lot of patients who end up being released from custody to die at home?
So I talk about the compassionate release process as a big part of the story. And, the process is very, very logistically complex. There's steps along the entire pathway that make it difficult to achieve. So there's a paper that was put out by Families Against Mandatory Minimums, FAM, and it's called Everywhere and Nowhere. And the reason is because there are processes in every state and the District of Columbia to allow people to be released for medical illness. It's medical parole, compassionate release, these sorts of programs. But the reality is it's nowhere because the logistics of these processes are so hard. And California is no different than the other states. The legislature has all agreed, everybody's agreed that people like the man in my story should get out. And yet he came so close to almost dying in prison, which would have, altered the course of his family's life. And it would have been wrong because nobody intended for him to die in prison. So there needs to be a systematic review of this legislation to make it logistically feasible. And part of that, I've worked with UCSF a bit on a number of training programs where we've gone and trained doctors in Hawaii, in New York State, about how to prognosticate, how to identify people earlier in the process so that we can put in our request for compassionate release sooner, how to phrase your request for compassionate release. Just saying, I think somebody has less than 6 months to live, can they please get out, isn't going to be enough for a judge to make that decision. So really putting in the details that a judge might need to be able to fully make that decision.
So are there other countries that we can look to for inspiration on how to improve our criminal justice system?
So I think that's a great question. There's only so much we can do with our current system. And there's a lot of countries in Europe who have taken a really different perspective on how to manage criminal justice issues. One that comes to mind is Norway. In the 90s, they were having a lot of trouble inside. They had 60 to 70% recidivism, similar to the United States. They're a small system, but they had 2 officers killed in a year, a lot of inmate-on-inmate fighting. And they realized that the way they're doing things isn't working. And instead of continuing to do that same thing, they decided to undergo a pretty massive reform. So one of the major things that changed was they started thinking of these people as your future neighbor. So everybody who is incarcerated in Europe, the vast majority of people return to society. Life sentences are not common. 15 years would be a very long sentence. So they're really looking to prepare people to be good citizens and to be their neighbor, potentially their neighbor. So what they did was they shifted to a system where they're looking a lot more at getting to know people. It's called dynamic security. So in the United States, we do something called static security, where we lock people up, we put them in cuffs, we put them behind bars. They don't use the chains and cuffs and bars to the degree that they did in the past. In fact, it's very minimal. They're maintaining security by getting to know people, by forming relationships. The officers will play volleyball with the group. The men are allowed to have rooms that look similar to more like a college dorm, so they have privacy. They can reflect. They can grow and become the people that we want them to be. So Norway has really reimagined the way that they rehabilitate people. And it seems like something that we have to think about in this country. This whole idea of you take away somebody's liberty, but you don't take away their humanity, because our goal is to bring them back into society. So I think we could definitely look to Europe for some ideas on how we could be better.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I'm just thinking about what you said about fear, and that crime came to mind that took place in Norway of that man who I think it was a massive shooting, and I think it was children. And I remember hearing in the news that his sentence was something like you said, like 15 years, which in Norway is a really long sentence. But for us, we're like, what, 15 years for a crime that was that heinous? If you were going to explain this to somebody who, say, falls on the more conservative side of the spectrum and painting this image of prison as a place where you're playing volleyball with the security guard and that kind of thing, I feel like somebody might smirk at that.
So I think that the main reason to think about doing things in a different way is because what we're doing currently isn't working. We put people in solitary confinement, and then we release them to the streets. I'm not sure we're making people safer. You can be punished and still be allowed to go to groups that actually support you or help you reduce your substance use issues. In the United States, 50% of incarcerated people have mental illness or substance abuse disorders. And those are things that by being compassionate and allowing them to be treated for these problems, we will make society safer.
I want to pivot a little bit to your conversation with your son. And you describe sort of this internal struggle about your job and how, on the one hand, it feels good to be doing this good work and it gives your life meaning. But then on the other hand, it's very emotionally challenging and incredibly frustrating for all of the reasons that you just described, and, perhaps not the best fit for someone who's seeking a job that is smooth or easy or amounts to a good state of mental health and work-life balance and those sorts of things. And so I'm wondering, how does that tension affect you? How often do you get to that place where you're like, maybe I'll quit, and then come back and say, no, I can't? Kind of where are you in that dialogue?
Early on, I would have that dialogue daily, I think. But at this point, and I tell the story like it was that one moment, but it was a combination of all those moments that made me get to the place where I am, 12, 13 years later, where I'm sort of at peace with the tension between working for this organization and being able to feel what I'm doing makes a difference. And the work-life balance part, I think I've sought out things outside of the department, like this, like telling a story. It's cathartic to be able to tell a story about all of these challenges and to have other people relate to them and hear them. And also this relationship with UCSF where we're doing these trainings. One of the trainings we did was in Hawaii, and it was teaching parole officers to have more empathy for their older parolees and how challenging it can be to get to a parole appointment. So the training, the parole officers put on glasses that simulate macular degeneration or cataracts. They put on gloves to be a little bit of peripheral neuropathy. They have bungee cord to make their gait altered. And then they're supposed to take, beans and put them into a Monday through Sunday pill kit so they can remember to take their antipsychotic medication so they can get on the bus and get to their parole appointment on time. And one of the officers was putting her beans in the container, and she finally just is dropping beans all over the floor, and she says, God damn it, now I have to be more empathic. And she was joking a little bit, but she also was seeing that, wow, I didn't realize how hard and how complicated it can be for an older person with common problems that older people have to get to the appointment. And in many places, you miss your parole appointment, you go back to prison for 12, 18 months. So it's very common. And, that all plays into not just with older people, but with younger people, these ideas of very high recidivism, because some of the recidivism is is parole violations, which when you don't have resources, it can be very hard to get yourself where you need to be. I teach classes whenever I'm asked for the same reason. And the idea that maybe some of these stories will compel them to go forward and do research or work towards improving the compassionate release process or address some of the troubles with solitary confinement gives me some sense that I have that work-life balance, that I'm not just slogging away inside the prison walls every day.
Well, I'm really glad that you are speaking out about the work that you're doing and teaching, and that you came to share your story with us. We're so grateful to have had you come and speak and come here for this interview.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. And if you haven't heard the first season of our show yet, I recommend you check it out. You don't want to miss those episodes. And if you like what you're hearing, please visit our website or find us on Patreon and click Donate to support our work. You can find us on Twitter and Facebook, and don't forget to spread the word, tell your friends, tell your doctor, and leave us a rating and review on iTunes. We're also thrilled to announce our first storytelling contest. So if you're a student or a resident, consider submitting a story to us related to the theme of learning. If your story is selected, you'll receive a $500 cash prize and a slot on Season 3 of the Nocturnists podcast. To learn more about the contest, visit our website at thenocturnists.com. I'm your host, Emily Silverman. Special thanks to executive producer Ali Block, podcast producer Marina Poole, program coordinator and head of story development Adelaide Papazzolo, sound engineer Alberto Hernandez, assistant producer Kirk Clockey, our podcast intern Chloe Lassard, social media manager B. Logan, our illustrator Lindsay Mound, our composer Yessie Monroe, and the voice of Boaz Monroe, and our fundraising lead Cecilia Peterson. This episode's story was coached by Eliana Monroe. And last but not least, thanks to our storyteller, Michele DiTomas. Till next time, we are the Nocturnists.